Right, let's go. Hi, folks. Welcome to the pre-recorded session for this week, where, as you know, this week we're looking at the school experience for children and young people who are in care. And throughout that session, I'm going to be talking to you about a number of the barriers that young people face. I'm going to look at some of the outcomes that young people who are in care have educationally as compared to their non-looked after friends. We're also going to spend some time thinking about how schools might make the school a more welcoming and positive experience for children who are in care. So that's what we're going to be doing. And for this recording now, we're very lucky to have a old colleague of mine, Mel, who used to be a Newman University student. So it's amazing. Mel and I worked together while she was doing her dissertation a few years ago, and she's gone away, got over the trauma of being a Newman University student, and has gone on to do some really amazing things, not least joining the team in one of the local authority areas in the West Midlands, joining one of the teams as part of their school service that is there to support children who are in care with their education. So that's what we're going to be doing now. I'm just going to be chatting to her, finding out a little bit about what she does, and just kind of getting some of her knowledge and wisdom, really. So, Mel, do you want to say hello? Say who you are. What did you do your dissertation on? Stuff like that.
Hi, I am Mel. Hello. And as Keith said, I am a former student of Newman University. Very proud of that fact as well. I started off doing a foundation degree in, I forgot the name of it, teaching and learning support. And then I did a top-up award to earn my full degree in working with children, young people and families. And as Keith told you, he was my dissertation tutor. And I did my dissertation on young carers. And I found out at that time there was not very much research on young carers, and that was a really important role for me in the job that I worked in at the time. And as a part of that role in the school that I worked at, that then developed. So I was also working with looked after children and children who had experienced domestic violence in the home. And that's how my role then developed, and I left the school to come and join the virtual school and work as an education development officer for them.
Excellent, thank you for that. I won't embarrass Mel, but she did ever so well in her dissertation. Got a fantastic grade for that. It was a fantastic piece of work. So that's good. So you said that you, at the time of doing the top-up award, you were working in a school.
Yeah.
Time with particular groups of children, and then it sort of expanded more to encompass the groups of children who are also in care, and then that led you to work for the virtual school. Do you want to just actually, as you've mentioned it, we've talked a little bit about it in sessions, but do you want to say a bit about what the virtual school is, because it sounds like a bit of a weird name of something. So do you want to just kind of clear that up for us? What is the virtual school?
Yeah, virtual school. It is really difficult to explain to people that don't understand. We are a team of staff. We're quite a small team. We've the head of the virtual school, which is the only statutory requirement for any local authorities, that there is a head teacher for the virtual school. And then we've got 5 EDOs and we have got a advisory teacher. So we are a small team, and our role is it's the same as a school, really. We have to oversee the young people on our register, so to speak, and have knowledge and understanding of where they are at academically and their well-being, their mental health status. And yeah, we just need to know everything that a school needs to know. But our children are not in one building. They're in many buildings right across the country, some in borough, some out of borough. And, you know, we have a method and a system that we use to keep a track of those young people. So yeah, that's pretty much it really. But it's very difficult for people to understand that we're a virtual school, but we're not a physical building in the sense of a school.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So it's to provide monitoring of progress and support for children who are in care. Just to kind of pick up the point, and before we were recording this, Mel, we talked about this, but students will also remember that if you're a child who is, for example, whose parents were living in Solihull when the child entered care, then if Solihull Council then takes the parents to court and gets parental responsibility, then Solihull is the corporate parent until the child stops being in care. And it's that school, it's that local authority that has a virtual school. All local authorities have it, but for that particular child. So then if that child then gets moved to Warwickshire and then is being educated in Warwickshire, then Solihull Virtual School, because it's the corporate parent, would be then the one that is responsible for that particular child. Mel, we're not going to say whether Mel works for Solihull or not. I'm using Solihull because I've been using it as an example to students throughout the module. But so, as I said, Mel works for the local authority that has corporate parenting responsibility for that child. And as she said, they might be schooled all around the country. Actually, so that's really helpful. Talk a little bit, maybe a bit later on, about what the virtual school does in terms of supporting the education. But what might be helpful to start with is if you could talk a little bit about some of the barriers as you see them to children who are in care in terms of their schooling. And I mean, in terms of barriers, that could be kind of broad. I'm also interested in hearing a little bit about kind of attitudes towards children in care as well, if as part of those barriers or not, as you perceive them.
Okay. I think for me, the biggest barrier, well, you can't say there's the biggest barrier. The most obvious barrier is the fact that the children are in care, and they're in care for a reason. You know, they will have endured some amount of trauma, some traumatic experience, and that although they might not see the reasons, their understanding might not be that what they've experienced is traumatic. Being removed from the parents definitely is. So we might look and think that, you know, the neglect is traumatic, the abuse that they might have suffered is traumatic, but they, as young people, have only been used to that, so that it's just life and to them, so they may not see it as traumatic. But like I said, being removed from parents definitely is. So that's, you know, a huge barrier. If you put yourself, I always try to imagine being that 6-year-old, that 7-year-old, and thinking, what am I feeling if I, you know, if you've picked me up and took me away from my mum and my dad, what am I feeling? I'm not going to be interested in what you're doing. You can read the story to me all you like, but my focus isn't going to be there because I'm worrying about what's happening in my own private life. I think that's the most obvious barrier, as I've said. The other barriers that you probably don't think about straight away is the placement moves, repeated changes of professionals that are around them. You know, social workers do change quite frequently, especially when a child comes into care, and that's not because the social workers left, but because of the, you know, when a child's first taken into care, that each authority will have a different title for a team, but for my authority, we have a court management team. And so they'd have social worker within that team. And then once the case had been finalised, it had been through the court system, then they'll move again to a children in care team. so that, and then we've recently had a reshuffle in our service. So we've got an under 14s team and an over 14s team. So there'd have been a change again for some of our children. Social workers leaving under authority. And along with changes of placement is another thing. So, as we talked about previously, some of our children are no longer in borough, they've moved out of borough. I've got children in Leicester, children in Manchester, I've got children in Wales. So, if you change to a neighbouring authority, you can potentially maintain the school placement, which is always the thing that we're looking to do, is to maintain school placement for that stability for the young person. But we have to be practical. And if amongst the youngsters being moved from their authority to Manchester, you can't physically keep that school placement. That's, so there is another placement move. So yeah, there are lots of barriers. There's, and I suppose one that isn't as obvious is, as Keith said, it's about perception and people's attitudes. And I think, and I don't know why it is, but I don't say this lightly, most of the time, schools and the adults around the young people have high expectations for our children, but there are some that don't. And they think, they've been through all of that, what do you expect? And they're happy to sit back and accept what is happening, and they're not striving for better for the young person, really. And that's one of mine and my colleagues' biggest challenges when we go into a school and there's that acceptance. And, it's like, oh, well, they're working at age related. So, they're working at age related, what more do you want us to do? Well, what we want you to do is to push and strive for achieving greater depth, working towards that level. And, they've got SEN, they're never going to achieve, they're never going to close that gap. Well, we don't know that if we're not trying. You should be striving for and doing what we can to close the gaps for this young person. So there are lots of barriers for our children, but we as a team, that's our job really, is to challenge schools and to ensure that everybody has got the highest of expectations for those young people.
That's really helpful, actually. I'm gonna pick up on a few of those if that's okay. Just in terms of some of the practical stuff around moving. So if a child, as you said, if a child moves to Manchester, they can't commute to school from Manchester back to the West Midlands every day. That's just totally impractical. So how does your service then prepare the way? What does that do? Obviously, you get notified that the child's moving to Manchester because their social workers decided that that's the best possible move for them. You'll get notified, presumably. What do you do then at that point to make sure that they're at school and that the transition to the new school is a good one?
Okay, so that will vary. And that varies on whether it's a planned move or whether it's an emergency move.
Yeah.
If it's a planned move, that's fine. We can speak to our colleagues in, let's use Manchester as an example. So I could speak to a colleague at the Manchester Virtual School, ask advice about schools in the area to where the child's going to be moving to. We'll approach those good and outstanding schools, because that's an expectation for us, is that looked after children go to a good or outstanding school. So I can approach those schools. We can do a bit of research into them, advise the new carers to go have a look at the schools to make the application. Then we can look at a managed transition. So there would be conversations between both schools. We'd be talking to the current school, asking them to create a bit of a leavers book for that young person, so they can, you know, take memories with them, because a lot of our young people, when they move around, have no physical things for the memories that they've moved, you know, that they've made in a previous placement. But yeah, and then we will be, as a virtual school, we'll be setting them up on a new school up on our system, so that we're liaising with the designated teacher in that school. We can talk to them about the information that we already hold on that young person, so their attainment, their progress, what their strengths and the difficulties are, what their interests are. So if I've got a youngster moving that's really musical and they've been having music lessons, I'll be saying to them, have you got music provision, so we can get those lessons back straight away for them. That's something that they're familiar with. It's comforting to them. So we can kind of pave the way and make sure that there's a really good transition plan for them. When it's an emergency move, it's not as easy. All we can do is, and we usually get told when it's an emergency move after the event. So the placement, there's been for whatever reason, the placement's broken down, the child's been moved to a new placement. Then we get notified that they've moved. Sometimes we'll have a chance then to still talk to the carers about schools in the local area. But the key for us is to not have a gap in education and to get them back into school. So we kind of have to work on the hoof in that respect and get them into a school, and then we'd arrange a PEP with the social worker in the school within 10 days. That's the requirement, is that it's in within 10 days of the placement changes, a new school start. And I would always, in that case, invite the previous school staff along so that they could share information. The new school's not going to have enough information about that young person in 10 days, and they're still going to be wanting to learn about that young person. So I will always ensure that the previous school is invited to that. But yeah, it does really depend on the situation and how the move has taken place.
That's helpful. A few other things that you said are really helpful as well. So you said that within the first 10 days of a school move, a PEP, which stands for Personal Education Plan, so that's a planning meeting, takes place. I often find myself in lectures saying to students, it takes place soon. I can't remember how soon it needs to be. So it's every 10 days. And then after that, is it every term after that? Or is it every, yeah.
Well, to clarify, it's 10 working days. And that's from when a young person first comes into care as well. So when a first comes into care, you've got 10 working days to hold a PEP. And if there is an education change, you've got 10 days. It doesn't always go to plan. It doesn't. And, you know, like when I have my year 6 that transfer to year 7, I can't do 52 year 7 transitions within 10 days. It's not going to happen. It's physically impossible. But in an emergency breakdown, we'd try to make it within those 10 days, the same as if it was a new to care child. And then, yes, we review then progress termly after that. So we'll have a PEP in each term. If we've got a young person, like I've said, they're brand new to the school, we'd have that initial PEP with the new school, and we might have an interim PEP mid-term, but the requirement is 1 PEP per term, per child.
That's really helpful. Just on that, because in terms of practical, I've been to a number of these meetings, but students won't have and won't quite know what they are. So who normally go? I mean, you mentioned the designated. It might be also helpful if you just say what, or do you want me to say what a designated teacher is? Do you want to say what?
No, you can.
Okay, so designated. All schools have to have one, and they're a teacher, member of the normal teaching staff, who is really responsible for overseeing the education of children who are in care. So lots of schools have. All schools must have a SENCO, whose role is to support children with special educational needs. And all schools have to have a designated safeguarding lead, and all schools have to have a lead on a particular area and aspect. So children who are in care, all schools have to provide a designated teacher. And from my experience of fostering, actually, if you've got a good designated teacher who's committed to, Mel's nodding off screen here, she knows what I'm saying. If you've got a good designated teacher in the school who's committed to their role in the children in care, it makes ever such a big difference. Really, really does. And maybe that's indicative of the fact that they're in a school where there's a good culture of support and care. But in my experience, they're a really key person in terms of making the school experience a positive one. So yeah, have I missed anything on the designated?
I think the only other thing I'd note is that a designated teacher needs to be able to authorise spending. So, very often we get to meetings and there's a teaching assistant that works well with the child holding them, like representing for the school in a meeting, which is fine. I've been that learning support practitioner that's gone into a meeting. But what would have to happen then is that would need to be the funding and the spending of pupil premium needs to be approved by somebody that can approve the spending of money, because as that TA in a class, I haven't been able to approve that. I can say I'll go back and ask, but yeah, they need to be able to agree on spending and authorise spending.
That's handy. You've mentioned the pupil premium as well. That won't be something that the students are familiar with. We're going to talk about it in the lecture, but all children who are in care have a sum of money. It's not a huge amount of money, actually. It's a sum of money. And Mel, what is it at the moment? Do you remember?
Well, in our authority, we usually send £600 per term. This term, we're sending £700. But yeah, ordinarily it's £600 per person per term, except for early years. And early years is just £100 per term.
Right, okay. And so that's basically additional money on top of the money that schools get for all children.
Yeah.
Unless a child's been identified as having a special educational need or anything like that, there's no additional funding. So that's kind of it. In terms of the barriers that, and we'll talk about this in the lecture actually, in terms of the barriers that Mel has mentioned, really, that's the only additional money that comes to overcome those quite considerable barriers. So the spending of that's agreed at this PEP meeting, isn't it, and decided on what that stuff gets spent on. Actually, just as we're talking about that, and apologies for kind of jumping around the subjects and stuff, what are the sort of things that money normally goes towards? In your experience?
Okay, so for my authority, we're pretty clear about how we will authorise, with exceptions, but they're all based on an individual basis. We predominantly will say that it is for, and it should be in all authorities, to improve the progress and attainment, academic attainment for our young people. So we will say yes to them using that for tutoring, whether that's a tuition service or whether that's with a member of staff in school that's more familiar with the child, or if we will say yes to them using it to purchase resources that would, that are specific to that child's needs. We will support the use of that to address an SEMH need for a young person if that is a barrier to them achieving in the classroom. So we will say, yes, you can use pupil premium to, and I should clarify, we're talking pupil premium plus now, which is separate and not the same as pupil premium. So we will approve of using pupil premium plus to buy in a therapeutic service. That could be a drawing and talking, Lego therapy, play therapy, if it's felt that that is what that young person needs in order that they can access the curriculum later on, so that their emotional well-being is being addressed as well. We will authorise it to be used for training for staff. So if we had a youngster who had a diagnosis of ASD, but there was nobody in school that was suitably qualified in dealing with ASD, we would say you can use the pupil premium to train your staff so that they can better meet the needs of that young person. All of the spending should be around that young person and their needs. Something that we don't approve of it for in my authority, and again, all authorities are different, we don't approve of it being used to pay for trips and residentials, to buy uniform, to pay for transport. Anything that we would expect a parent to pay for in school, we expect the carer or parent, if the child's living with a parent, and that is our only exception. We would expect them to pay for that. If a child is a child in care but placed with parents, which there are some, we would make allowances for pupil premium plus being used to subsidise trips or residentials for that young person, because they very often are not in a position where income isn't as good as parents at work or foster carers who are in receipt of a fostering allowance. And so we would support in that case with things like trips, residentials, and purchase of uniform. But that is our exception. But we have, for the last 2 years now, because of COVID, have supported with using pupil premium to buy technology, so laptop devices. If we haven't had them to issue directly, we have allowed schools to use pupil premium plus to buy laptops, but that's not something that we would ordinarily support. Pre-COVID, that wasn't something that we did support, but with remote learning being such a priority now, we've obviously had to adapt and take that into account.
That's helpful. A few things, actually. It's quite a broad set of things. One observation, and and it's my observation, is that but it does vary across local authorities. It sounds, whoever it is you work for, that they have very, very clear ideas about what it should and shouldn't be spent on. Other authorities, in my experience, are less so, or are catching up to that. I think that's the first thing. And then the other point to make, really, and I was interested to hear it, actually, and that was that you might have a child who's got an additional need, and you mentioned autism, for example, and support for that. And so you would provide the additional support. So it's very child-centered, actually. What does that child need? And there might be other and instead of waiting for other funding to come along in order to support that, you would just go and support that anyway, because it's that holistic thing, which is really nice to hear, actually. And that came as a bit of a surprise to me. So that's really good. So that's what the kind of pupil premium is. We talked about the PEP meetings, personal education planning meetings, which happen ideally within the first 10 days of a school move, and then every term. We've mentioned a bit about who are there. I mean, in terms of who, is there a specific requirement on who needs to be there? So my experience is one of the foster carers is usually there. If they're a child who's in foster care, I mean, presumably you also work with children who are in residential care as well. So someone who's their carer, usually the carer's social worker's there, the child's social worker, someone from your team would be there, and then the designated teacher from the school. Is there anyone else I've kind of missed?
No, and that's in an ideal world. The realism, right, the only requirements at a PEP is school, the designated teacher, and a social worker. Okay, so it's not a requirement that the foster carer or parent attends. That's good practice, the same as the virtual school. Some virtual schools, one of our neighbouring authorities, they don't attend PEPs at all. We do. It's our mission to attend as many PEPs as we can. We can't attend every single one because our cohorts are too big and there's too many meetings. There's not enough days in the year for us to do enough of the meetings, but we endeavour to attend as many as we can, and definitely one per young person each year, and ideally that would be a face-to-face. But the actual requirement is that there's a social worker and the designated teacher.
Okay, that's useful. And then just kind of going right back to something you said a little while ago. You talked a bit about when we were talking about the barriers that young people face. Talked about that the trauma of being in care, and we've talked. The students and I have talked about that earlier in the module as well, where the events that have led to going into care can be traumatic because of, either neglect or abuse or difficult parenting, whatever. But also then going into care itself and being separated is a traumatic experience. So it's really interesting that you kind of centered stuff around that. And what's your sense of, and maybe this is a really hard, this isn't scientific and I should be dealing in scientific really, but in terms of the schools that get it, do schools get that trauma stuff? We've talked earlier in the module with students about being more trauma informed. What's your experience? Because they've obviously got lots of other agendas. They've got to, be met by Ofsted, and there's some discussion about whether Ofsted are going to start to, as part of their inspection requirement, whether they're going to start assessing schools about how they're good with children in care, which would be interesting. So I'm getting around to my question eventually, which is, what's your sense of how trauma informed their practices in schools?
Okay. What I would say is that it's getting better, certainly in the authority that I work in, but we as a team are striving to improve that. We, as part of our designated teacher training, are offering a series of modules on trauma and attachment training to our designated teachers, with a hope that they roll that out to their schools. We offer and have agreed, the virtual head here in the authority that I work in is really keen for our schools to be trauma informed, and he is paying for whole school training for a number of our schools, and his remit is that we will pay for that for you as long as it is a whole school training. It is a whole school approach, because it's so important that not just the designated teacher understands trauma. As a school, you all are aware of how that may impact, the damage that it can cause, and how to meet a child where they're at and help them, I don't want to say build resilience, but help them cope with their life experiences. So it's really important for us as a team that people do understand that. So we are investing heavily on training our schools in that. And we have also offered membership to ARC for some of our designated, we offered it to all of our designated teachers, and a number of them have signed up to that. And that is, again, it's around trauma and attachment, and just furthering their knowledge in that and looking at how they can take that into whole school practice. So it's something that we are investing heavily on, because it is really important that people understand that.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And the whole school practice, I mean, arguably this is more, my example's more the case for high schools, but, it's all very well having a small number of teachers who are really tuned into the needs of children, and then they go to the next class who shouts at them and just kind of behaves like a a proper fascist. It's pointless, so it does need to be whole school. I mean, again, Mal's nodding, you'll have experience, I'm sure, of kids in schools where they do really well with some teachers, funnily enough, and then there are others that seems to be where the problem is. Well, the child hasn't changed, have they, from one class to the next? The only variable is the teacher, but it's the child that then gets dealt with as being the problem.
Yeah, it's the teacher that sees them as naughty.
Absolutely.
That's where the problems lie, and that's what we need to eradicate, really, is that we have a teacher that says, okay, I understand that you're behaving in this way because of your experiences, and what can I do to help you? How can we manage this better? So
yeah, and that leads us back to another point, very helpfully, obviously, as if we'd planned it, which was your final point that you made in terms of the barriers about expectations and those kind of low expectations, and it does connect to that. In some way, some teachers are trying to be paternal and helpful and saying, well, we can't expect too much of them because they've had a tough time, and then there are others who think what they expect of the children is that they're going to be sort of two-headed demons and they're going to do these terrible things, and then either way the child is kind of problematized and not left kind of not having a very good experience. I'll get around to a question in a second, Mel, I'm sure. I'm just kind of discussing it, really. So yeah, because it's a hard balance, isn't it? It's a hard balance between saying these children have had difficult experiences, and we should be aware of those and tuned into it, but not allowing them to be defined by that. And that kind of low expectation. I mean, do you find that happens a lot with this low expectation, where teachers are like, well, as long as they're not throwing chairs around and stabbing other children, then I'm happy with them just to get on with it, and I won't, I don't know, what does this low expectation look like?
I'm thankful to say that I don't get it a lot, not in terms of a low expectation. I think what I find most is, I don't know if it's like complacency, really. It's, well, they're doing what, this is my big one. Well, we don't know what to spend pupil premium on because they're working at age related in all their areas. That they're on track to get a standardised score of 100 in the SATs. And bear in mind, my focus is year 6 and year 7. So for me and my personal experience, it's not that, oh yeah, but they was never going to get it. So I don't get that, but I get that, like I said, that complacency. Well, they're working at, so we don't know what to spend it on, really, because they're working at age related.
That's interesting. So what you're suggesting is that, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're suggesting is that it's not so much a low expectation, but it's certainly low aspiration in terms of if they're all working at the mean average, then that's all we're really interested in.
Yeah.
Whereas lots of children work at very different gauges beyond the average. That's why it's an average, because people are above it and below it, right? And so they don't really push for beyond that kind of average stuff. That's really, really interesting, actually.
Yeah. And what I find as well is that people don't focus on a wider curriculum and wider life experiences for our young people. So okay, they might be working at age related, and you're saying, well, and I appreciate, I've had children go through the school system, and I appreciate the difference between age-related expectations and then being able to achieve greater depth. And I understand that is a really big jump and would take, beyond accelerated progress for them to achieve that in a term. But if you're telling me in year 5 that young person starts year 6 with me at age related at the end of year 5, I want to know why we're not pushing for greater depth at the end of year 6. And if it is that, you know, they're saying to me, oh, well, the stress might tip them over the edge, they're a little bit, you know, their emotional state is that the added burden of the extra learning would, then why aren't you widening their experience and then giving them something else to, you know, why aren't we doing some form of enrichment with that young person where they're going to, you know, they could grow and develop in another area, not just academically. So if, you know, if they've started having the music lessons in year 4, we offer free music lessons to all our looked after children in year 4 and 5. So if they've started their music lessons in year 4 and they're doing them in year 5, why aren't we offering them opportunities there? Why aren't we offering them the chance to go to the young people orchestra and things like that? It hasn't always got to be about academic attainment, although our focus is on improving academic attainment. It's about strengthening the young person holistically, like you said earlier. It's about, you know, making them, enriching their life with different experiences. So why aren't we, you know, I've had a school create a gymnastics club because I had a young person that loves gymnastics and is always, you know, the foster carers, they never sit still. They're always gamboling around the living room. They're, you know, handstanding up the wall, and they just want to do gymnastics. So I've said to school that, you know, they're really, really passionate about gymnastics. Can we do something? They said, we'll start an after school club. We'll get one of our sports coaches to come in and start an after. Fantastic. Use some of the pupil premium to pay the salary for the PE coach to come in and deliver that, so that this young person can have that experience. So yeah, it is, you know, that's the thing. It's getting the school to understand that it's not just about academic attainment, it's about enriching that young person's life and the wider curriculum as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, isn't it? My sense of it is that if you can't silo children's lives. You can't say, right, well, you put them in school and then they just become this single focused academic being, and then outside of school they become something else. You've got to kind of do that whole stuff across the board. So yeah, no, that's really helpful. You mentioned about how does that, all of the stuff that you mentioned, you've kind of highlighted a lot of really good practice, and I wonder whether that's, when you talk about stuff within your authority, is that, I'm thinking about that divide between children who are schooled in your authority and also then children who are schooled outside of authority. How easy is it to do that? Because if you've got a bunch of local schools that are committed to the ethos of what you guys are trying to do, how do you then get schools that are in Manchester, like we discussed earlier, that aren't on board with this stuff? How do you get them on board? What are the challenges to that?
There are challenges to that. We offer a lot of different things that our outer borough children wouldn't access as readily. So what we would do, we will link up with the virtual schools in the areas that there are. And, you know, when we offer, for instance, we offer an arts project, and we do that in conjunction with our neighbouring local authorities. But when we send out our invitations to our designated teachers, we send them out for all looked after children in our schools. So if there is a young person in our schools from Leicester, if there's a young person from Manchester that are looked after to Manchester and Leicester, we will invite them in any of the activities that we put on, so they can come and join us, even though they're actually looked after by a different authority. And we then will speak to our the virtual schools in our other authorities and say, look, we've got a young person that's just moved to Manchester. They are going to this school. Are there any extracurricular that you're putting on that you can involve our young person in? If so, can you contact the designated teacher at the school? And so it's that we did the same with our music. We offer our free music lessons to our children, and I've got children in Birmingham schools that they're accessing it through a Birmingham their music provision, and that's kind of how we reach some of our children that are out of borough. But there are things that is one of our barriers for us being able to offer exactly the same service to our children out of borough is that is the problem. But we would, like I said, call on our colleagues in their virtual schools to support us with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful. So there's kind of, and they're informally reciprocal, it's not easy to say, reciprocal relationships. But they are kind of informal, and I suppose some will be more open to that than others.
Yeah.
So,
it depends so for us as a virtual school, we offer quite an enriched variety of things aside from monitoring the PEP. So, we do an Aspire to University program. We provide all of our foster families with the opportunity to have either registration to the, what's it called? It'll come to me in a minute. We offer them an annual pass to the Black Country Living Museum or the Telford and Wrekin Museums or the National Trust. That's the one that I was thinking of. And we'll provide all of our foster families with an annual pass for them so that they can take the young people and experience different things, enrich their lives. We do the Aspire to University. We offer training for our foster carers in real and REAM, which is raising education and literacy, and raising educational attainment in literacy and raising educational attainment in mathematics. Then what else do we offer? The music programme. We offer in Year 6 a Thrive package, which is either academic support in the lead up to SATs or social and emotional support for our students who might be anxious about those exams, tests. And we offer the same for our Year 11s as they're heading into their GCSEs. So yeah, we offer a whole variety of different things. We've got the arts package, the arts project, we've got a sports project. So we offer all of those besides what we do as, what is our specific role in the monitoring and of the academic attainment for our young people. So,
that's great. And what's really helpful about all of this is that you answered another of my planned questions earlier, so I don't have to ask that anymore in terms of that. What I'm interested in, you mentioned earlier about the statutory requirements. I know that all local authorities have to have a virtual school head, and it's a relatively new post actually that came about. Certainly you can probably tell me when it came about, but
don't ask me when we had to have a head, because I can't.
No, I can't remember off the top of my head either. It's but it's within the last 5 or 6 years at least, anyway. So and before that, there used to be teams anyway. They were looked after children education services and all that sort of stuff, which then became amalgamated into this new role of the virtual school. What am I saying? Oh yeah. So the question is, what are the kind of legal requirements then? Local authorities have to have a virtual school head.
That's the only legal requirement. The rest is guidance. So the guidance, I'm just going to flick down and look at this. So the main points of the guidance is that we understand that looked after children, I keep saying looked after children, and I shouldn't. I should be using children in care because that's what my authority has moved to.
Right.
But you get ingrained with something and it's difficult to change it then. Is that we understand that our children are almost always at a disadvantage to their peers, and a large number of our looked after children have an additional SEN, and if you look at SEN within the children in care community and compare that to children in non-looked after community, then it is a higher percentage. And then that we work as a corporate parent for our looked after children. So we will go in and advocate for the child and the parent or carer in terms of, we would be the mum or the dad of a non-looked after child. We're that voice and advocate for them. And also new roles to the virtual school. In 2018, we gained the responsibility to work as an advisory service for previously looked after children. So any child that's been adopted or has left the care system to a special guardianship order or a child arrangement order, they are previously looked after children. So we are responsible for being an advisory service for the parents and carers of previously looked after children. But we don't have the same requirement in terms of monitoring progress, and we're not responsible for the pupil premium plus for those children. And our newest edition, which was September 21, that has been delayed somewhat and the new date hasn't been given yet, but we are going to be taking on responsibility for all children with a social worker moving forward.
Is that just within your authority, or is that?
No, that's across
Okay.
the country. But we will have the same remit as previously looked after children. So we will be there in an advisory capacity. So that has meant we have employed 2 extra members of staff now in preparation for that to kick in, really. But you can imagine that our numbers will significantly increase when we're looking at all children with the social worker. So any child on a SIN plan, a children in need plan, or any child on a, help me out, what's the other plan? A SIN or I've forgotten the name.
It's all right.
So any child that has a social worker in our authority now, we will have responsibility for overseeing and advising.
That is a really big change, and actually, I think a really welcome one. What we're going to do in the lecture is we're going to look at the outcomes, the educational outcomes of children who are in care, and one of the comparisons that the Office for National Statistics makes is, as opposed to all children, and also then children in need, which is this category which students will have learned about in their safeguarding module. And what we know also from the data is that the outcomes for children in need is really not a very great picture either. So I'm kind of encouraged to hear that actually your service is taking on that remit as well, because it's certainly needed, from what the data tells us anyway. So that's really interesting. As you were talking a minute ago, one of the things that sprung to mind, I hadn't considered it before, so sorry for the non-pre-warning bit here, is just around disciplinary incidences and procedures and stuff, because you mentioned about being the advocate for children in care as if any other parent would. What we know from the data is that children who are in care are much more likely to experience a fixed term exclusion than their non-looked after friends, and it's about equal in terms of permanent exclusions. It's only equal because more kids are getting excluded permanently than they were before. So it's an issue for children in care, I suppose is what I'm saying. So how involved do you get in terms of those discussions around discipline, either whether they go to fixed term or full term exclusions, or whether or not there's other things like, reduced timetables, internal exclusions, even things like detentions and stuff like that? How involved do you get in that process?
Well, it's funny you should say that. We in my authority have been really lucky in that we haven't had a fixed term exclusion since 2016. However, last week we did, and it happened to be one of my caseload. How involved am I in that? Fairly involved in terms of all the meetings on the run-up, and to put it into some context without going too wayward, it is a young man with an EHCP for SEMH, who I've worked with him since I've been in the virtual school, and my recommendation and advice at his year 6 initial PEP was that we look for a SEMH provision and not a mainstream school. Contrary to the advice that was given from myself, the primary school, SEN, the foster carer and social worker at the time disagreed with our decision and put him in a mainstream school. So he kind of was set up to fail. There have been numerous meetings throughout his time in year 7. Bear in mind, we were only in the 2nd term. And we called an emergency annual review to look at changing the provision. I've been involved in all of his PEPs up to then, all his planning meetings up to then, the EHCP review. He culminated, he had a 5-day fixed exclusion, and the school had then at that point decided that they were going to permanently exclude him. At which point my boss, the head of the virtual school, had been in discussion with the head of the school, and ordinarily we have managed to stop that from happening for our young people with the added support from ourselves, whether that be monetary or a member of staff going in on a regular basis throughout the week to touch base with the young person. Unfortunately, we've not been able to protect the place for that young person, and they are going to be permanently excluded, which is really sad for us because, like I said, we've not had a permanent exclusion since 2016. So we've had a good old run at it, but we are quite heavily involved in those processes when and there could have been a number of permanent exclusions for our young people, but because of our involvement and the involvement of our head, we've managed to, like you say, avoid that by looking at reduced timetables, by looking at changes of provision for a more suitable provision for that young person. Because very often a permanent exclusion comes about because the setting that they're in isn't suited to their need. So we work very closely with our colleagues in SEN and inclusion support to put together support packages until we can find a more appropriate provision for that young person. It just happens that we're crossing authorities for this young man that I've had permanently excluded this last week. There's been a cross of local authorities, which has led to information not being shared as it should have been. We're all aware of the challenges that faces when we're working across authorities, and it's through no fault of his own. He's being permanently excluded. He has obviously done things and behaved in a way that he shouldn't have done. But ultimately, I think it was decisions that was made on his behalf that have led to this. And I think had the advice been listened to in the first place, we wouldn't have had a permix on our hands now. But we have.
That's a really helpful example. I mean, there's a lot within that, really, isn't there, about actually finding the suitable provision in the first place. A really good match is important, because if it isn't, then as difficult as it is, him leaving that school under those circumstances is not great. But it sounds like he probably shouldn't have been in that school in the first place, and hopefully whatever is going to happen from then on is going to be a more suitable and positive one. So it's just about that, the circumstances under which he's left. So you would, you would often in other situations, and obviously in that one, but you would fight to ensure that all possibilities are explored before exclusion happens. And then if it does, then really your job is kind of goes back to that whole, well, what's the most suitable place then that we can find for him? And in terms of schools, because that's once you've got them in, what we know is that children often wait a very long time to find a school. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier on in the discussion. Do you kind of have any difficulty persuading schools to take children in the first place?
To be honest, not usually. The problem lies is when we're looking at smaller schools, usually more rural schools actually, where they're, a one-form entry and they're already oversubscribed, and then we're asking them to take in another youngster who is very often going to come with some amount of challenge. And, even if they don't come with an amount of challenge in terms of their learning or their behaviour, it is another youngster that is going to require extra meetings every year. So we kind of are, that's the only time where we find that it's really difficult to place. I mean, when we're looking at natural transitions, so from nursery to reception and from if there is an infants to juniors, there are not many in our authority. I think we've only got about 4 schools now that you have to apply for junior school. And then from primary to secondary, our young people are prioritised anyway, so they will be the first to be allocated places and almost always get their first choice school. It is when we're looking at midterm transfers, we sometimes find it more challenging and more difficult. And just because you're already trying to fit a young person into a school that is usually already at capacity. But what we find is that the local authority will direct. If the head teacher says no, then the local authority will direct them as it's a child in care, they'll be directed to take that young person.
Is that the same for academy schools, or is that for maintained schools? Because I understand there's a difference.
Yeah, there is a difference, and I don't understand the technicalities of the differences, but I'd say that the academies that we have in our authority are pretty much directed the same, and so they'll take. And to be honest, most of them they don't even try to resist, because they kind of know that they're going to be directed if they don't. So it just makes sense for them just to say, okay. I mean, there are incidents where, and one of my things is we have a bit of a battle with social workers who will say, and this is contradictory to what I've just told you, but our social workers will say, well, it's fine because they're looked after, they'll get a place. And we have to say to them, there are only those natural transition stages where our children are absolutely prioritised. But when we are looking at putting a young person into a school that's already full or at capacity, the school have a right to say no. Everybody says, oh, they're looked after, so they've got to take them. They haven't. And there are situations where the local authority won't direct a school because they'll say they are already 5 children over pan in that year group. So to put another child in there is detrimental to every learner in that classroom. So you've got to consider the other learners as well as the young person that you're trying to place.
Yeah.
There are incidents, and we also have where we've asked a local authority if we can move a child to a place, and they'll say no because the school's just gone into special measures. So we're not going to direct them. We need to look for another school, which doesn't go down well with some social workers and carers. But so yeah, there are incidences where it is a challenge, but they are benefited by the fact that they are children in care, and it isn't as big of a problem as if they weren't children in care. I think it's probably the one time that they're advantaged to their children in care counterparts. So
yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, what you speak of there, I've had kind of very direct experience where it's during those normal transition periods, that's very, very straightforward. Often children don't come to us at those times. They often come at different times, and so you can find yourself having quite a fight on to get schools to take children. That's really good. And I've got one kind of final, really sort of broad theme question to ask, and that was, and again, it does link really nicely to what you said already. It's just about how can different practitioners, you've talked about what you folks do to support the education of children in care, which has inevitably led us to discuss a little bit about the role of teachers and social workers and carers as well. But are there any kind of specific things that you can think of that children need from other practitioners? I suppose what I've got in mind is that, you know, our students that are watching this will go out into practice very soon, and they may well become someone who meets a child who's in care, and very well meet you or your counterpart in a local authority virtual school. What can they do? What sort of messages would you want them to go away with? How should they approach children in care if they end up in a school setting, and what might they be able to do to help improve the outcomes for them and their school experience more generally?
Oh, it's a difficult one. It is because you think, you know, if you got the answers, it'd be a perfect world out there, wouldn't it? I think what I'd say is, for me, it's having that understanding of trauma and attachment, and understanding emotion coaching as well. So when you are faced with a young person who is presenting in crisis, and that can either be kicking and screaming and effing and jeffing, or sat under a table, huddled away, not wanting to speak to anybody, is that you take on board what their experiences might have been and try to have an understanding and empathy with them, and be able to talk to them about it, and just always have that at the back of your mind, that this isn't just a naughty child that's kicking and screaming for nothing. There is a reason that they're doing this. Just have that understanding that behaviour is communication. So if they, however they're expressing themselves, is to try and understand what they're trying to communicate. And I remember talking to a psychologist once, and she said, you know, whatever they're making you feel, however you're feeling is what they're feeling. So if you're getting wound up and frustrated because of what's happening, that's what they're trying to tell you that they're feeling. So, and it's just to try and understand that, I think, and be sensitive in your approach to that. And, you know, on a practical level, it's the absolute obvious is that you're not discussing their care status in front of their friends or other members of staff, that you are sensitive to the fact that that's their information, and if they're ready to share that, that's entitled, you know, that's their entitlement, it's not yours. I've gone into schools before and heard members of staff have come up to me and said, oh, you know, his foster carer said so-and-so today. I'm like, his peers don't need to know that he's got a foster carer. He might have told those people, that his peers, that that's his daddy or his uncle or his granddad. You know, it's be careful in your use of language. And if you do know that a young person who's going to be in your classroom is a child in care, and, you know, you might be the teacher, you might be the teaching assistant, but if you're aware of that and you think that a subject might be delicate, you know, if I had a youngster the other day that was asked to draw their happy place, they're a child in care. They've been in care for 6 months. They haven't got a happy place. So when you're looking at lesson planning, if you're going to be teachers or supporting in a class, is that you consider what is being brought, what the activities are going to be, what the discussions are going to be. And if you think they're going to be sensitive, have that discussion with that young person away from his peers or her peers, and say, this is going to be the discussion today. Which of it, what are you happy to talk about? What don't you want us to talk about? And just be tactful in the way that things are delivered.
I love that. Our foster daughter a few years ago was sent home with a piece of homework that said, describe your similar characteristics to your mum and dad. I mean, just utterly inappropriate. And awful. So yeah, and on one level, a teacher might be forgiven for doing that, because that sounds like quite a nice thing to do, but actually it's an appalling thing to do for lots of children, including children in care, but not exclusively children in care. So I think that sensitivity and thoughtfulness is really helpful. And one of the things that you started by saying, and it's amazing, because students listening to this will know what their assignment task is, and their assignment task is to demonstrate an empathy for and an understanding of the life world of children with care experience. And actually, you said they needed to have an empathy and an understanding, and so without any kind of prompting, we didn't scheme that one to start with. That's a really, I think, a very helpful place for us to kind of to draw this conversation to an end. Actually, it really is about just kind of trying to think, well, how might I be as a frightened 10-year-old kid in this situation with all the experiences that I have, and then just that kind of final thing as well about do children need to know, other children need to know the child's in care? I've always kind of been led by the child themselves. If they want to tell their friends, that's great. If not, thinking about when we have meetings, do we pull the kids out of school time to have meetings? I'm always very resistant to that. We had I won't say which authority it was with. We had a meeting recently, and it's called a LAC review, which is where they review. And the independent reviewing officer was surprised that our foster child wasn't in the meeting, but the independent reviewing officer had scheduled it during school time. And I'm thinking, I don't know why you should be surprised, because clearly, so there's always kind of competing barriers there, and you sort of touch upon that as well. So there's some very practical ways of thinking about that. But that empathy for and understanding, I think, is really key. So we will end on that. Thank you so much. It's been really, really useful. I found it incredibly interesting and helpful. I've learned loads myself from you today, Mel. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure that the students, if they were here, they would thank you for your time too. So brilliant. Thank you.